Welcome to the Moynihan Report here on the Two-Way Network. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan. Today, we're talking about Iran, past, present, and future. And I just wanted to start because we haven't done this show since Israel started its attack on Iran and Iran's nuclear facilities and its missile capabilities. But I just wanted to say this because we were actually, Guest and I, and we're going to get to her in a second, we're just talking about this, is this idea that this is a preemptive strike, that there hasn't been an ongoing war against Israel and the United States. And if you remember the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Death to America chants, and go by that embassy now in Tehran, and you'll see a monument to that event. And just think back, 1983. The barracks bombing in Beirut, 241 Americans died, 59 French people died. This is just, by the way, this is just a few. I keep going through all of them. The Israeli embassy bombing in Argentina, 29 dead. The Jewish Community Center, which is the craziest one of all in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, 85 dead. This is not attacking a government installation. These are attacking Jews in Argentina. 1996, of course, you know, the Khobar Towers, where 19 Americans were killed and 500 people injured. And in March, let's just say March, in this year, right where we are in Brooklyn, 2 men were convicted of trying to kill Masih Alinejad here in Brooklyn. That was the Iranian government, and that's what the prosecutors said. But there's one that you probably never heard of, and that's 1992, the assassination of 4 Iranian Kurdish dissidents at a restaurant in Berlin called Mykonos. You don't know about that, but if you want to learn about it, my guest today, Roya Hakakian, wrote a book about that episode called Assassins of the Turquoise Palace, as well as a memoir about her childhood in theocratic Iran, Journey from the Land of No, from which she escaped in 1985. Roya, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Can we start with that? There's a lot of people that I know who are Iranian exiles. Mm-hmm. They either have never been to the country or they left when they were very young in 79, 80, 81. You were there till 1985, so you remember this.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'm a rare breed. I was there until Saddam Hussein was actually hitting the cities.
Yes.
So the war between Iran and Iraq, which began in 1980, had moved into major cities. And so part of what's very frightening about the current bombing is that it's bringing back all the memories of that longer war. Yeah. And yes, so I was a teen. I graduated high school and left Iran.
You're, and I know it sounds like a probably an odd question, but it's been a long time. I mean, you're an Iranian. Do you still consider yourself an Iranian? I mean, you've been here for longer than you've been in Iran. Yeah. And Iran is a country that is totally unrecognizable to you now, I presume.
Unrecognizable and recognizable. So unrecognizable as far as the physical space is concerned. You know, I can't recognize streets, places I knew are no longer there. In that way, it's unrecognizable. But in many ways, it's recognizable because the regime has made it so. And it's uncanny how capable they have been at being consistent. Mm-hmm.
Consistently awful.
Consistently awful. And in some ways, I said this once, and I have thought about it myself over and over again, that there is a quality to tyrannies, and that quality is that they freeze time. Mm-hmm. Because nothing moves, because everything is about controlling what everybody does and how everybody does everything. And therefore, years pass, and there is a sense that nothing has changed. And that's incredibly true about the regime in Iran.
And it's an incredibly wealthy country. It could be a wealthy country, an oil-rich country. And I'm talking at the beginning about, very selfishly, talking about Americans who have been killed by the Iranian regime and its various proxies. Others in Argentina, et cetera, Kurdish exiles. But the Iranian regime is the biggest threat to its own people. I mean, the people of Iran are the ones who suffer daily through this, horrible exercise in 3 decades of totalitarianism. If you're in Iran and you voice an errant thought, I mean, I know the name of prisons in Iran. I should know the name of prisons in Iran, right? What is it like, to be an Iranian now, to be a dissident? Because we have seen, Neda Sultan, this woman who was murdered in the streets. You have seen uprisings. In various places, Iran's a very big country. You see people rise up, and there's videos of it. There must be a little bit of latitude for people to protest. Mm-hmm. So, like, from what you know, what is it like to be an Iranian, either dissident or free thinker in this day and age?
Mm-hmm. Well, something really important happened, and that's the huge change in demographics in Iran.
A very young country, yeah.
Very young country. Yeah. But also, let's not forget that in 1979, the total population of Iran was less than 40 million. Yeah. And today, it's edging at 90 million. Yeah. So when the country grows into that amazingly large, doubles its own size within the span of 40 plus years, then there are things that you can't control as much as you would like to control, in a minutia sort of a way. So people were talking on the streets. I heard from a lot of reporter friends who went to Iran and said, as soon as I got into my taxi cab, the driver was ranting against the regime. Yeah. So in some ways, they had allowed, certain amount of political steam to get out. Mm-hmm. But as long as that certain amount of steam didn't come together to join and turn into a political movement or turn into a public protest. So if you were, people saw this regularly, reporters, everybody. And that's part of the reason why so many reporters went to Iran and never got the story. They came back without really getting under the skin of the country, the politics. And part of it was because, people do complain. People rant against the regime. But
there are women who take their headscarves off, dance in the streets on camera, and then, of course, you see that some of them go to jail for that. But people have an amazing level of bravery. To me, I'm just absolutely shocked by this.
Yes.
Women who take their headscarves off and film themselves get beaten by the morality police.
Living daily life
yes.
turned into an act of civil disobedience.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that you organized an act of civil disobedience and you carried it out on a particular day at a particular hour. Day-to-day living turned into a public act of civil disobedience. And part of it was the women's hijab, but there were a lot of other things too. Joy, owning a pet dog. These are the things that are banned in Iran. And therefore, if you have a dog, it's, believe it or not, it's a political statement because it means that you are defying the regime's rules, that no one should own a dog in Iran. Now, sometimes they enforce it, sometimes they let go. But these are all daily acts of disobedience that Iranians have been performing.
It's like the hijab you see in younger girls. It gets higher and higher, and just so it's just covering that whatever they can get away with. And someone once told me this, and I actually read this. A journalist say this too, that those of us who are American who travel in Europe, and get a little tired of the kind of anti-American sentiment that you see a lot in Europe. And someone said to me one time, if you want to go to a place where people will treat you very well for being American, go to Iran. Mm-hmm. And I said, you have billboards everywhere with the Statue of Liberty as a skull, and the flag burnings after the prayers, and this, and it's like, well, no, the young people have a different relationship with it. But I was thinking about that, and this is a tough one. You see the bombing campaign that's happening now. Israel says it's hitting strategic targets, it's hitting military targets. But it's taking out, people in the IRGC, people in the regime, and that's in Tehran, right? Mostly in Tehran. Mm-hmm. what effect do you think that will have? Because you have so many people that are very, very, hopeful. And I get the hope that maybe this will be the uprising that, so many Iranians have been waiting for. Is there the possibility that this has the opposite effect, though, that when you're living under aerial attack and you don't really care who's doing it, but a friend dies, people, your neighborhood, your building is blown up, does that worry you vis-a-vis the freedom of Iran in the long run?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned my memoir at the top of the hour, and there is a moment in that memoir, in the last chapter, when I am walking on the streets of Tehran. It's August, and Ramadan has come, and I don't know how many degrees the thermometer was reading in those days, but it was blisteringly hot. And the Islamic dress code laws were enforced to the maximum degree. So I was under this black headscarf, full uniform, pair of pants. You had to have closed-toed shoes. These are some of the things that they have kind of eased up on over the years. But, in the beginning, they were brutal about it. And there was no water because it was Ramadan. And I'm walking and thinking, if somebody bombs these characters right now, and even if it means that I will be taken out as a result of the bombing, I will be happy. Because it is possible to be that furious, that angry with the state of things, that you would say, even if it means that I will die alongside with them, let me go. It will give me, it will give me pleasure.
I want to read you something that this was a quote that I took down. It was an Iranian journalist who was talking to the BBC, and he was unnamed. And the BBC interviewer asked him, and this gives you a sense of what's happening in Iran right now, said, in Israel right now, these ballistic missiles are hitting and people are running for shelter. And he said to this journalist, who was an unnamed journalist, do you do the same? Is there something similar? And he said, no, we don't have the luxury of shelters. We have a subway, but subways are not open to the people after 10:30. Otherwise, you can go to the basement of your own building. So in this society, going to the shelters when there's a jet fighter or looming around it indicates your chicken heartedness. I understand what he's trying to say. So you should be brave, embrace for the bombardments, and enjoy martyrdom. That was from a journalist in Iran yesterday. This is not somebody who's in America trying to get rid of the regime, saying, no, we don't have bomb shelters because we're supposed to be a shaheed, be a martyr.
Exactly.
I mean, that's... Exactly. So, but what you're saying is you would want that for liberation, but there's some people that think you should have that to be closer to God, right?
Right.
And to sacrifice yourself for the cause.
So what kind of a regime can build a better future for its people when it's at the same time advertising or cultivating the idea that the best you can do with your life is to become a martyr?
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult bargain that there is no sense of future, there is no sense of hope, because what you have heard all your life is that the best thing you could possibly do is to blow yourself up or to go die. And so that's what has really frustrated generation after generation in Iran. And one of the things that actually emerged from the Woman Life Freedom 2022 movement was this campaign that began on social media called Normal Life. And people were posting what it was that they wanted from a revolution. And they were the simplest things. Because, the rest of us, we think about revolutions, we think about, Mahatma Gandhi, we think about Nelson Mandela, and you always associate these movements with grand ideas of, we'll build a parallel democracy and, achieve freedom. But people in Iran were saying, #normal life, walk with my wife holding hands on the street, kissing,
Yeah.
something, people can't do.
Music.
Music.
Popular music.
You
things
know,
like that, yeah.
have a dog, walk my dog without being afraid of being stopped. And all of that turned into that famous song that eventually won a Grammy. But it's the normal life that really became the impetus behind the movement that we saw in 2022 and prior to that. So, what I'm trying to say is that little by little, the degree to which there was a sense of grand idealism about change in Iran it dwindled and turned into much smaller, tangible things that I think were much healthier aspirations for a democratic change than were those things that people were talking about, in 78 and 79, which led to the revolution of 1979.
Yeah, in which so many people in the West fell for. I mean,
along with the people of Iran.
Yeah, people of Iran too. I mean, you had the Tuda party, the Communist Party was like, I love the fact that the American Communist Party, looked this up, people, on their Twitter feed, we said, we stand with the people of Iran, meaning the government of Iran, something very explicit. And I wanted to say, do you not know what happened to your compatriots in 1979, 1980, after joining up with the Ayatollah who comes back from Paris? And of course, very famously, promises all these sort of liberal things, and then asked about it, says, I lied. I lied to you.
I lied.
Which I appreciate the fact that he was just out and said, I lied. But there were so many people in the United States, Michel Foucault, Richard Falk, these people who defended the revolution, which is absolutely baffling to me. But I wanted to mention this in your experience with this, is that the regime in Iran is so vindictive that it follows people outside of the country who are Iranian, now Iranian Americans, Iranian expatriates, people in the Iranian diaspora, and terrorizes them abroad.
I wrote a piece about it.
Yeah, you've had your phone and social media hacked by the Iranian regime. Have you had that?
Yes,
yeah.
I wrote a long piece for the New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
Because the FBI came to my house. My kids were very young, opened the door, and it just like, when FedEx comes to your door, my son, who was, 9 or 10, said, Mom, it's the FBI, and I went into the living room and they say to me, we have information that, the Iranian regime is trying to find you in this country, and there's nothing we can do for you to protect you, but it's our duty to warn you. And
when
since
they say
before
that,
and
find
after
you, what do you take that as?
Well, as somebody who's written about Iran's assassinations, I don't assume that they want to take me out for a cocktail. I assume that they want to kill me because they've done it. Iran had, as early as 1980, a long list of 500 individuals that they were going around the world very successfully killing, from country to country. The first one of them happened in Maryland in the United States in 1980, where, somebody who had dressed up as a mailman knocked on the door of one of the former ministers in the Shah's government and handed a bomb to him. So that was one of the first. But they were really methodically...
Was there anyone ever prosecuted for that?
It's a terrific story. I think the New Yorker ran a very wonderful long story about it decades later, when the killer, who had fled the United States, he was an African-American guy who had converted to Islam, ended up going to Afghanistan because they gave him an apartment in Iran and a BMW or something that they had promised him to give to him if he had, he did the assassination, which he did. But then he found life in Tehran really unbearable. So he left it went to Afghanistan and ended up playing in a movie. Long story. And then the family went and watched the film and spotted the killer and so called the authorities, and long story. But yes, he wasn't prosecuted, but the best prosecution for any of the regime assassinations took place in Berlin, Germany, after the 4 Kurds were killed. So
I mean, it is in some way an appropriate punishment for an American to be forced to live in the Ayatollah's Tehran. And this was a common thing in the Cold War. People would be spies and do things for the Soviet Union and end up living in some dismal apartment block outside of Moscow, wishing that they didn't hate capitalism so much the first time around,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this kind of, but the global reach of this, and I mentioned Argentina, I mean, this stuff is wild in the sense that people don't really geographically locate Iran and realize that, for instance, the obsession with the Zionist entity with Israel, they don't share a border with Israel. There's no common concerns with Israel. But there is a singular obsession with Israel in America. They pretend to be mad about the 1953 coup that overthrew Mossadegh, in which the Ayatollahs were involved in overthrowing Mossadegh. They didn't like the liberalism of Mossadegh. What is it that drives Iran beyond the sort of millenarian Shia Islam that we all know about? I mean, is there an overarching goal? I mean, I hear about the hidden imam, which I'm sure you know about and this stuff. What is it about the mullahs and the leadership that kind of motivate them?
So there are 2 things that are hugely significant about what you just raised. And I think it's hugely significant, especially for those who say, what has Iran got to do with us? It's over there, Well, I think the first thing to remember about what has Iran got to do with us is that during the encampments on university campuses, we saw the students who were protesting wave the flags of Hezbollah. That's what Iran has got to do with you.
In a park in New York. Yeah.
You saw it.
I saw someone in a park in New York with a Hezbollah flag.
Right.
And so,
So I don't know why people don't seem to make the connection that if your children in colleges are waving the flag of Hezbollah, it means that Iran's #1 aspiration from 1979 onward to export its revolution has partially succeeded. But to go back to your question about Shiism, Ayatollah Khomeini was still in Iran in the early 60s when he began giving his very fiery sermons. And I should mention that Ayatollah Khomeini became the leader that finally led the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and which toppled.
And he was exiled to Paris.
He was exiled to Paris at some point. He was initially exiled to Iraq, and then Iraq threw him out, and he had to go to France, and he was in France in the late 70s before returning to Iraq.
It's amazing that the French take him, but the Iraqis won't.
The Iraqis took him for a while, but then they had to get rid of him. So this is, I think, a brilliant formula that he happened upon, which I think is the formula that somehow got reproduced here in the West and in our country, in the United States, which is that in the very early 60s, he was very young. He was kind of trying out to see what inflames people to kind of stir them and bring them together. And so in the beginning, he was just talking about the moral corruption of the monarchy, and how by allowing women to take off their Islamic dress code and take jobs and go into get out of the house and work, they had caused the moral corruption of an Islamic society. So he kept talking about that, and he wasn't gathering momentum. He had his own constituents. He had very religious conservatives who agreed with him, but that was a very tiny portion of the entire country, and he wanted more. He was far more ambitious. So at some point, for some reason, he changed his tune, and he, rather than focus on women, he started talking about the American imperialists and its bastard child, Israel. Mm-hmm. And the moment his sermons moved from the issue of the moral corruption and the women and their, uncovered hair and short skirts to imperialist America that is oppressing us and the blood-sucking Zionists, all of a sudden he gathered momentum. And a lot of the...
Don't mind the short skirts, but we hate the Americans. That was the play.
Lord. You mentioned the Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party.
Yeah.
This was manna from heaven for them.
Yeah.
And so...
The language they spoke, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what was very ironic was that Khomeini was adapting all of the communist rhetoric into his own religious language. But they were... copies, exact copies of the originals. So in other words, the proletariat became the downtrodden in a very, Persian sort of terminology. Then the bourgeois became the mustakbarin, which was, also the equivalent. And so all of a sudden, a lot of the young, educated, leftist Iranians started to pay attention. And all of a sudden, he went from being this backward guy who was just talking about women to this potentially national figure. Now, the reason I think this is important is because this is precisely what has happened since October 7th. You see, LGBTQ, super radical lefty, university students or otherwise get together with Islamists on the streets of London and elsewhere. And whether this is happening, organically or by accident, the legacy is the legacy of Khomeini.
It's an amazingly good point. I mean, it's, the revolutionary language was the language of the 60s and the 70s.
Yes.
And to speak that language was to attract people. And particularly when you see like the radicals in Germany, for instance, the big push of that movement was when the Shah came to Berlin. It was all about the Shah. It was obsession with the Shah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was all the communist rhetoric, but Islamicized. So he was brilliant. He was very smart. He realized that this is what sells. He couldn't say proletariat and bourgeois, but he understood that the concepts were appealing and sexy, and so he adapted it into an Islamic form. But the second thing that that I think is very relevant and important is that think about what that guy Khomeini was trying to do. It's early 60s. He wants to lead. He's hugely ambitious, and he wants to make his mark on the world of Islam. But he's Iranian. He doesn't speak Arabic, and he's a Shia, which means that, all the other Muslims in the world are Sunnis, the overwhelming majority. And this guy, with all of his ambitions, happened to be born in this culture that belongs to a minority within a minority. He's a Shiite, a Persian-speaking Muslim. Yeah. So how is he going to make his mark on the Muslim world? And I believe that he adopts the cause of Palestinians to make his mark. Because the moment he becomes the champion of the Palestinian cause, the moment he is the guy who, unlike the King of Jordan or unlike Anwar Sadat, is going to remain uncompromising to the death, is the moment he appears to be the savior of all the downtrodden Muslims everywhere.
In bridging that Sunni-Shia gap.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, because it is really remarkable when you think about it, how did this guy who was leading, a revolution in a Shiite country, amid a Sunni ocean, right, managed to become so important.
It was the Palestinian cause.
It was the Palestinian cause. It gave him the identity of an Islamic prophetic savior. And you know this history well enough to know that he was no longer just an Ayatollah Khomeini. Immediately, around 1978, 1979, people started to refer to him as an imam, Imam Khomeini, which meant that they had risen him from the rank of, a cleric to the rank of a saint. And that's how he became who became. He became the savior.
But, it's funny also because at that point in the 70s, the Palestinian cause was a secular Marxist cause. It was mostly people on the left. The PFLP was a Marxist group. The PLO was, largely a Marxist left-wing group. Revolutionaries, quote unquote, from Europe came to train in various places in the Middle East because it was like a left-wing factory for revolutionaries. So the rhetoric meets up perfect with that, doesn't it? And then all of a sudden, in 1983, I mentioned the barracks bombing, which is the kind of opening blow for Hezbollah, right? And that is a catastrophic, and actually, the Reagan administration pulls back after that. It was actually successful, right? But when you mention this as, these things impressed people in the region, but now there are not a lot of people in the region that are really willing to stick up for the Iranians. And from what I have heard from people who know, are secretly like, yeah, go get them, Israel. We will never say that publicly, ever, particularly because our commitment to the Palestinian cause, but not well liked in so many places across the region. So the Iranian project, the sort of extremist Shia project, is on some pretty rocky shores at the moment, isn't it?
Absolutely. But think about the sort of tension that totalitarian societies inevitably create. Because in the beginning, they're promising heaven and 72 virgins and all those, things that are going to come your way as soon as we come to power. And then, none of that happens, and life becomes sheer misery within the span of a few years. And so the tension that in such totalitarian society, in Iran specifically, was created was that everything that the regime stood for, the people celebrated, and vice versa. And so the more the regime said, death to Israel, people didn't fall in love with Israel, but they began to think, I don't give a damn about Israel. Israel is not my cause. And sometimes people just did the opposite. And I'm sure you've seen the footage of Iranians chanting, take the flag of Palestine and shove it, right?
Yeah.
And I think the same tension also exists within the other totalitarian, or at least, undemocratic Arab societies where, people live under censorship, there is no freedom, and there is a government that isn't delivering on the people's demands. So if that government has friendly relations with Israel, the nation certainly turns on Israel.
Yeah.
And that consistently is what's happening. I mean, MBS, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, he would love to sign the Abraham Accords with Israel yesterday, but he's not because, his people would, turn on him.
Yeah.
And so it's this tension that continues to exist between these leaderships that are undemocratic and, oftentimes totalitarian, and their populace.
Yeah.
And so if the regimes are pro-Israel, the populations are anti-Israel. And if the regimes are anti-Israel, like the government of Iran, the population certainly either becomes curious about Israel, or just says Israel isn't my cause, Palestine is not my cause, and even more. I am pro-Israel, which is a lot of what we have heard out of Iran in the past.
Yeah,
few
I mean,
years.
it's if you ever saw a pro-Israel demonstration by people who looked vaguely Palestinian from a distance, it was probably Iranians in America, like they play it in Europe. This is a unique moment, right? I mean, Iran has survived without much challenge, to be honest, through its proxies. Those proxies are in pretty difficult conditions right now. Hamas is effectively neutered. Hezbollah has been its leadership has been completely eliminated. They're doing nothing to support their Iranian brothers right now that Israel is attacking. Iran, they have the Houthis left, right? The Assad regime in Syria, all gone. I mean, this is an incredibly vulnerable moment for Iran.
It was vulnerable before the bombings.
Yeah.
I mean, so since then.
Yeah, and of course, there was the attacks in October on Israel, the drone attacks, et cetera. And the Israelis softened them up by, taking out a lot of their anti-aircraft capability, et cetera. So the Israelis own the skies over Iran right now, just flying wherever the hell they want. What does this mean to have all those proxies on their knees and the Iranians really not, they're responding with ballistic missiles into neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, which is destructive and horrible, but they're not targeted in any particular way. They hit the IDF building in Tel Aviv. It's a pretty big building in the middle of Tel Aviv. They don't look like they're in a position of any strength right now. And in fact, there's been some reporting that they're begging Donald Trump to come back to the table. Does that mean to you that they worry about their existence, the existence of the revolution, existence of the regime in the next month, 6 months, or a year?
Of course. But I think what's very odd in some ways is that usually when you have one terribly radical leader, the original, say Mao Zedong, right? The next generation softens up a little bit, keeps on with the big ideological statements, but knows better that going on with the same severity is not a good path to follow. And so they begin to, the second generation begins to soften up and, it takes the edge off the radicalism. What's very odd about the situation with the current supreme leader is that in some ways, he's acting more radically than his predecessor, who was, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini. In 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini realized that he needs to end the Iran-Iraq war. That was not part of his plan at all. He had said when the war began in 1980, which Saddam Hussein began, right? But once it started, he was, on cloud nine because, if you are a messianic, martyr-loving leader, the best thing that can happen is a war because you just create martyrs. And he celebrated it. He said, this is our second revolution. After the actual revolution, this is the best thing that has happened to us because we are going to go to Baghdad and then to Jerusalem, to free Jerusalem. So this was his plan. But by 1989, he not only had not reached Baghdad, he was far away from Jerusalem. And so he finally realized that he needs to relent. And he said, I am going to drink a cup of poison but agree to peace with Iraq. And that's how the war between Iran and Iraq ended after 8.5, 9 years, because he was pragmatic enough to finally recognize it was time to quit. And
but it's also existential, too. I mean, the casualties and the death figures are staggering in Iran. I mean, we're talking in the millions.
Yes.
And not everybody wants to martyr themselves. And when you have the young boys of a generation, this is why it's a young country, going into this, charnel house, this killing machine, there's a point where maybe the people aren't going to take this much longer. I wonder if there's any comparison to today. I mean, these are very early days, and obviously the Israelis, there's going to be civilian casualties. They say, I'm not on the ground, I can't confirm or deny this, that they're trying to hit only, military infrastructure, et cetera. But if there is a military conflict, that seems, and I hate to say this, but it seems to be the most likely thing to bring down a regime, right? I mean, internally, people say, Netanyahu says, 80% of Iranians hate this regime. I have no idea if that's true, and I don't think he does either. But what do you suspect people in Iran, from being Iranian yourself, knowing people in Iran, keeping in touch with people, what do you think the sentiment for this military action, on both ends, I mean, being attacked by Israel and attacking Israeli cities, is there a hunger for this? Is there a hatred of it? I mean, is it somewhere in the middle? I mean, it's a very hard question, I know.
Yeah.
But what do you get? What is your read on it from the people that you talk to in Iran?
Look, it would be foolish to say that people want war.
Yeah.
No nation wants war, especially a nation that had already lived through a very long and bloody and costly war.
Yeah.
And again, this war is bringing back PTSD of the Iran-Iraq war. So I think what's happening, and I hear this over and over again, is that especially initially, when Israel took out a lot of the leadership of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, people felt vindicated. You want accountability. You want these bastards to be put on trial. But if they continue to rule and there is no trial, then the next best thing is to watch them die, which is exactly what they got, through the bombing. So, it's what you hear from a lot of people inside Iran. You killed our children. You killed, so and so. They bring out all the posters of the kids who were shot or assassinated or hanged. Especially in 2022, to say, this is for that. This is for all the killings you did. But there is a sense of terror. There is anxiety. There is worry about, the loss of Iran's economic infrastructure, especially after Israel bombed the oil refineries. Yeah. So very clearly,
the Iranians bombed the Israeli refinery in Haifa. So
right.
That going on.
Yeah, I mean, Israel can't afford to do tit for tat.
Yeah.
Iran will do a lot of stupid things because Iran, we are facing a messianic leader who has been advocating for martyrdom. And by the way, he's 86. He can afford martyrdom. Yeah. And he's uncompromising, unlike his predecessor who agreed to drink the cup of poison. He is not about to drink the cup of poison. So he's going to go all the way out and do everything he can to provoke Israel. Israel has to be incredibly smart and not fall into the trap of responding in kind. Mm-hmm. So I think the bombing of the refinery was very stupid, because that's to people, to ordinary people, that's the wealth of the nation. That's not the military installation. That's not the Revolutionary Guards. That's not nuclear. That's what makes the livelihood of the people. And as soon as Israel starts to do things like that, it loses the whatever it has by way of credibility in the bank.
Yeah. And I don't want to have, my opinion on this doesn't matter, but I mean, the moral high ground with Israel, it's a particularly difficult time right now after the war in Gaza, mm-hmm. In which I think it's pretty fair to say that Israel is losing the international media war on this, mm-hmm. by quite a bit. Mm-hmm. had this
In
maybe,
part thanks to Iran, the narratives that Iran has been circulating for
absolutely.
many, many years.
Yeah, I mean it's funny that Israelis hit the state-run TV station. We've all seen this video now of the women on the air. But then, of course, the Iranian government turns off the internet. So there's none of these narratives are getting out, pro or con. But what happens to Iran? And I want to just, war game this, because it's what America didn't do with Iraq. They thought, we'll overthrow Saddam, and then we'll see what happens. Didn't really think that one through. What happens, let's say the regime falls in Iran, and I don't suspect that's going to happen or happen anytime soon. If that were to happen, are we looking at something where there's, civil war, or if there's, warring factions? I can't imagine after all of this trauma from 1979 to today, and even with the Shah before, that it's going to be an easy transition to anything. And that scares the hell out of me. That for the Iranian people, it scares the hell out of me.
I mean, neither one of us has a crystal ball.
Yeah.
My ideal scenario is that the bombing ends very quickly.
Yeah.
Whatever they have to do with, Natanz or Fordow, which are the two main nuclear sites that Israel really wants to get, then they cease to carry on because they have done what they needed to do.
Yeah.
And the bombing stops. And the Yugoslavia model, in some ways, is a good one. NATO bombed the former Yugoslavia, and Milosevic stayed in power, but only for a few months to a year, and then the indigenous activist movement that had existed, Otpor and others, took over and toppled him. I am hoping that this is what happens. The difficulty that the Iranian situation has, which is part of what I think is hugely important to pay attention to, is this regime that has been in power in Iran for 46 years never invested in the normal things that governments invest in, right? Like, improving the state of education, taking care of the environment. In fact, the opposite has happened. There is, if the bombs don't kill Iranians, water shortage will, because there has been so much mismanagement of natural resources, especially water resources in Iran, that it's water shortage is a very, very dire issue. So this is a regime that hasn't invested in any of these things that normally regimes or governments have to or do, but instead it invested all of its efforts at making sure that there is no opposition against it. No opposition within Iran, outside of Iran. I mean, and therefore you're now that there is this incredible moment that you could possibly imagine if there were a healthy opposition, this is the perfect time for it to sweep in and think about a transition to democracy and everything. There is none. There are characters or figures here and there, but there is no real coalition about which one can hope such a thing can happen.
These kind of outside characters that, the Shah's great niece or something lives in Virginia and wants to take over. Ask you one political question.
But I just wanted to finish the thought that I think, it may be that they, after the bombing stops, that these groups or individuals come together and build something, and then hopefully within a few months, because the regime has been so weakened, something can happen. This is my ideal scenario.
I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm just apologizing to her right now for doing this. But if you were in the position of advising the president who resists being advised by anybody right now. The debate within the administration between these kind of MAGA isolationists and the more traditional Republicans, I get very annoyed when they're constantly referred to as neocons. I mean, they're not all neocons. Some of these people are, kind of realistic about this. I mean, Pete Hegseth is very different than Tulsi Gabbard, right? They have different visions of foreign policy, but I wouldn't say that Pete Hegseth is a neocon. But right now, the Israelis are desperately trying to convince the Americans to involve themselves militarily in this conflict. Donald Trump seems to have acknowledged that when he tweeted or truthed earlier today and said, we, meaning Israel.
Own the skies.
Yeah, own the skies above Iran. No one's really proofreading this stuff and saying, Mr. President, maybe not the smartest thing to say, but we own the skies. So I guess we're in it in some ways. Is it advisable or wise because you say you complete the mission, which is to destroy Iran's nuclear program, then not necessarily regime change, but creating the conditions maybe for regime change. The Americans are the only ones that have this capability for Fordouz and all these places that are deep in mountains. That's a B-2 bomber with a bunker buster or a couple of bunker buster bombs. Israel's desperate for America to do that. Would you advise them to do that?
To take out Fordo?
Even if it's one action of getting in the skies with an American Air Force plane and knocking out the rest of that nuclear facility in a mountain in Iran?
Yes.
You would?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's a no-brainer. How many years do you want to go negotiate? How many years? For how long? How many years you and I have been picking up the morning paper reading, Iran is 10 minutes away from the bomb, 6 months away from the bomb. I mean, I can't even keep track. Enough is enough, and we tried it every which way, right? Because at first the Iranians were saying, it's just for peaceful purposes, and then, it changed, and then they wanted an apology for 1953, and then, we issued apologies, and then the apologies weren't enough. I mean, we have been at this for at least 2 decades.
Yeah.
And if we haven't solved it, going from Democratic administration to Republican administration, then it means that it can't be solved. And part of the reason is that a regime like Iran, which everybody kind of looks upon as, an Islamic system, needs, because I think the Islamism is simply a facade. It's really a mafia, an economic mafia that's operating behind the facade of Islamism, because it keeps the Westerners at bay. The moment you put on this Islamic face, everybody in the West says, it's their religion, their culture. We have to be respectful. We have to stay away. Whereas what's really behind the facade is just an economic mafia, just like any other economic mafia, totally rotten. And so for that economic mafia to remain in power, having access to a nuclear bomb is an insurance. And why wouldn't it want that insurance?
Well, what do you say to the people? Like, we addressed when people say, look, Iran has nothing to do with us. We're America. We're very, very far away. I pointed out, you pointed out. I think a sixth of the troops in Iraq that were American troops in Iraq that were killed by Iranian-made directed munitions, IEDs, et cetera. We talk about the past. What do you say to those people that say, look, we're inviting an attack on American troops in the Middle East, various bases in the Middle East. We're alienating our kind of half allies in the Middle East that we do business with. But they really don't have anything to do with us now. Maybe they did in the past. What do you say to those people who say, this is not America's fight, this is Israel's fight? We have the weapons, but and they've been bad to us in the past, but let's make a deal with them, and maybe they won't allow them to be bad to us in the future.
Okay, I don't know which ally in the region wouldn't be happy if Israel or the United States took out Iran's nuclear threat. You know, and I know that they have to say in front of the cameras that they condemn such acts, but in reality, Iran has been a thorn in their side.
I mean, it helped destroy Lebanon, helped destroy Syria, has helped destroy Yemen, has helped destroy the Palestinian territory.
Let's not forget Ukraine.
Oh, and Ukraine too, with the Shahid drones too.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I think that the simplest way to convey this to our fellow Americans is to say that this regime is not there to just survive. It's not another Cuba. It's not another Fidel Castro who says, I want to be a communist, and if the rest of you don't want to be a communist, so be it. Castro didn't have ambitions of castrofying the rest of the world. Castro wasn't out there to make sure that, students on university campuses were chanting his name or holding up his flag. But Iran does. And Iran has infiltrated and will infiltrate every dimension of our normal lives to the degree that it can. Because in some ways, our misery guarantees its existence. Mm-hmm. Because as long as we are successful, Iran proves to be a failure. In order for them to uphold this Islamist flag, we have to fail. Why would Osama bin Laden, which has nothing to do with Iran, he wasn't Iranian, but I think 1979 created an inspiration for all of these characters. Why should they hit our beautiful buildings with their airplanes, with their pilots? Because we have to become miserable in order for them to point to us and say, we have succeeded. And so, Iran has spread its reach to whichever way possible, as close as it can, to get to us. For instance, remember the Saudi ambassador was supposed to be assassinated in October of 2012 at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. Do you know how FBI caught found out about that whole plot? Because they had used the Mexican cartels, drug dealers, in order to set up the assassination plot, in order for the assassins to get in touch with an Iranian car dealer who basically became the point man to organize this. So they have very close ties to all the Mexican drug cartels, and they have used them in the past, as we know from at least 2012, in order to carry out their dirty business here in the United States and elsewhere. They are now in Venezuela, establishing very close ties with the regime there. So they have to make sure that we are not the America that becomes the envy of their youth, and therefore the idea of destabilizing and infiltrating our lives, our country, through whatever way possible becomes their main goal.
We're going to get to question from somebody out there in the two-way community in 1 second, but I'm going to allow myself to go a little bit long here and ask one follow-up on that, which I think is a pretty interesting point. I hadn't thought of this, is that you say that in 79, the Iranian Revolution is kind of inspirational for, before that, we do have like Sayyid Qutb and these people who are Islamist thinkers, but that's the first real Islamist state, right?
Exactly.
And people start following suit. People tend to forget that in the last years of Saddam Hussein's reign, He added a Quranic verse to the Iraqi flag. He made a Quran with his blood, in his blood. And there was a Saddam Hussein mosque that was constructed. And this was a socialist Ba'athist regime that came to power in the 70s. I mean, this is a very different thing. I hadn't thought of it. It is essentially Iran that is the engine of all, even if it's Sunni and not Shia, the engine of the Islamist movements and a kind of example that you can succeed and rule, right?
This was exactly what I hoped prior to coming into your studio, where we would get to at the end.
We would end on this. Look, it's perfect.
It's perfect.
And landing the plane perfectly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because, even Iranian secular intellectuals who want to vindicate themselves by saying, we unified, we created a unified front with Ayatollah Khomeini because he didn't look like an Islamist at the time. We took him for a Mahatma Gandhi, and that's how they read him. And the reason is because we didn't have Osama bin Laden, we didn't have ISIS, we didn't have Al-Qaeda, we didn't have Taliban. All of these diseases came after 1979. Now, I don't have a laboratory to say this caused that. But I can say for a fact that until 1979, we had not seen this Islamist phenomena that caught on like fire through the region and beyond. And what I think is fair to conclude is that the Iranian regime created a blueprint which became the aspiration and inspiration for so many others that have followed since, which have become our chief problems, whether it was, in Iraq or elsewhere or in Afghanistan, right? So what one can hope and also deduce from the experience of 1979 is that a major change in Iran can provide a major change for the rest of the region, just as it had done in 1979. And I really think that if Iran gets it right, that the rest of the region will follow suit.
I'm so happy that I ended where you wanted me to end. I'm so proud of myself. I didn't even know. She didn't tip me off to this. I'm just so good at getting exactly what you want. All right, well, let's talk to some people out there who have questions for you. And apologies for running long, but this is too interesting. We have Stuart with the Wilco poster. Hi, Stuart. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, good. You?
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So in the same way that Khamenei has been crueler than Khomeini, in the case that the regime doesn't fall, is there a potential successor right now that deeply concerns you?
That's a very good question.
Yes, I think if he ends up surviving, he will be far worse than he has been, even until this moment. That his uncompromising stance, which he, it's wonderful to look at Twitter and social media right now, because a lot of these clips of him are circulating saying, no negotiations, no anything, we are not going to, and there won't be a war.
Yeah.
And there are all these memes saying, what'd you say? No negotiations, there won't be a war. So I think if he ends up surviving, and kids in Iran have given me this very funny metaphor, which I'd never thought of, but I think it's so apt, that they're like game,
like video games.
Video game figures that, if they survive round one, then they kind of become enlarged for the second round. And if they survive the second round, they're even bigger for the third round. So I think if he survives, he takes it as an affirmation of his uncompromising position, and he will be even more brutal. And I think that's the most terrifying scenario that I can see ahead.
Is that he survives, and that, I mean, keeping in mind that Trump has said in the past couple of days, we know where you are and we're choosing not to kill you.
Yes.
So, thank us,
Right.
but don't fuck around.
Right.
I can say that.
Right.
Or we will eliminate you. And it's an interesting message to send, right? Is that, we're just, our beneficence is that we're the ones that are keeping you alive.
Right.
Which I think is, which is interesting. Well, thank you so much for the question. And guys like this make me look good because we have smart people who asked the very smart. I mean, Khomeini knows the difference. I'm very impressed by this.
They're so similar.
Yeah,
Exactly.
But thank you so much. I'm sorry we went way long.
Did
Roya,
we go way long?
But I want to. Yeah, we've been doing it for a while, over an hour.
All right.
We're okay. Okay, I just want to make sure we're okay. We paying overtime yet? Are these guys unionized? Do we know? Yeah. Oh, there's one. He's like, they got a union here shaking. But Roy, thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it. And thank you guys all for tuning in. And we will be back on Thursday. What are we doing on Thursday? It's none of your business. We want to keep you on pins and needles. So come back and we'll be here Thursday, usual time, 7 p.m. Come ask questions. And I think we might be talking Iran again. Who knows? We might even have a debate. I'm hinting at a few things, maybe. But thanks for joining us. And, subscribe to us on YouTube. And thank you all. There's a lot of you watching. Thank you so much for making this bigger and bigger every week. And do subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And join us Thursday. Thanks. We'll see you then.